Metamorphoses. Esse é o 10º simpósio, que é realizado há 18 anos, né? Chegamos à maioridade, já podemos votar. E eu agradeço muitíssimo a todas e todos aqui presentes, aos 34 palestrantes que aceitaram o nosso convite, aos 12 moderadores, todos eles foram coorganizadores dos 9 simpósios anteriores, a todos os monitores e monitoras também, são 15 estudantes, da graduação ao doutorado, e agradeço muitíssimo aos coorganizadores desse evento, professora Júlia Velar, professora Sandra Bianchi, professor Rodrigo Gonçalves e professor Rubens Sobrinho. E eu passo a palavra para dar as boas-vindas a todas e todos ao professor Ariel Novodrovsky, que é diretor do Instituto de Linguagem da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia, a universidade que coorganiza com a UFMG o evento. Em seguida, eu vou passar a palavra à diretora da FAFISH, a vice-diretora, a professora Thais Forlan, e depois a Júlia, e depois eu retomo a palavra. Então, por gentileza, professor Ariel, muito obrigada mais uma vez pela presença.
Bom dia, querida comunidade acadêmica. Uma satisfação imensa estarmos juntos mais uma vez. Agradeço grandemente pelo convite, professora Maria Cecília, para participar desta sessão de abertura da 10ª edição do Simpósio, Lendo, Vendo e Ouvindo Passado. Está me ouvindo bem? Acha melhor que tire a máscara? Tira a máscara? Eu estou aqui na direção da unidade, por isso que estou... Fica assim. Está ouvindo bem? Então fica assim. Bom, sinto-me honrado mais uma vez por nos fazerem partícipes de atividades tão significativas como esta. Tive a oportunidade de participar da abertura de outras edições, de outros eventos organizados pela professora Júlia, minha querida colega aqui na UFO, pela professora Maria Cecília. Então, nesse sentido que eu digo que estou muito honrado, lisonjeado por nos fazerem participar de mais um evento. Cumprimento, então, a vocês duas, queridas professoras Júlia, da UFO, Maria Cecília, da UFMG, em nome da comissão organizadora. Cumprimento também a vice-diretora da FAFISH, tenho o prazer de conhecer agora, nesta ocasião, aos demais colegas do corpo docente e discente da graduação e da pós, que se dedicaram com tanto afinco na preparação destes 3 dias de evento, né, para a exposição de inúmeros trabalhos e para a promoção de tantas discussões que engrandecerão esta 10ª edição do simpósio. Uma satisfação imensa, uma honra podermos participar e, ao mesmo tempo, acolher, então, mais uma edição do simpósio. Agora fico sabendo exatamente, são 18 anos adquirindo aí a maioridade. Parabéns, então, pela organização. E esta parceria tem se mostrado tão profícua entre a UFMG, a FAFISH, a UFO, o ILEO, o Instituto de Letras e Linguística, né, que promove, então, este diálogo de áreas tão afins, de áreas tão queridas, como são a filosofia, as letras, a história, as artes, entre tantas outras, que aqui estarão reunidas. Em contextos de tanta afronta à tradição da universidade pública brasileira, estarmos reunidos para promover movimentos de mudanças, de transformações, numa proposta que se apresenta regional e internacional, movimentos de ida e vinda, para lá, para cá. É uma atitude sempre necessária, louvável. Pensar a metamorfose, então, em sentido amplo e interdisciplinar, como bem descrevem as autoras no resumo da atividade, discutir o conceito em diversos campos do conhecimento, desde a antiguidade até o mundo atual, é um modo de articular inúmeras percepções possíveis, a partir da leitura, da audição, do pensamento, da visão. Então, parabenizo mais uma vez pela iniciativa e que tenhamos um evento muito proveitoso, que consigamos multiplicar muitas ações como esta. Um forte abraço, muito sucesso para todos e todas. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada, professora Ariel. Professora Thais, por gentileza, vice-diretora da Faculdade de Filosofia e Ciências Humanas da UFMG.
Bom dia a todos, a todas. É um prazer estar aqui também. Queria dar um bom dia especial aí, professora Maria Cecília, agradecer o convite, toda a organização, né, do evento. Bom dia ao professor Ariel, que também estou tendo o prazer de conhecer agora, nessa parceria aí. Estou representando a diretoria aqui, né, da Fafiche, que com prazer recebe novamente esse evento aí, muita alegria de saber que são 18 anos, né, é para a gente celebrar mesmo, e uma 10ª edição, então tudo para ser comemorado, né? Então, queria dizer que é um prazer para a gente, estaremos sempre de portas abertas para o evento, né? Nesse momento aí, como o professor Ariel bem disse, que são tempos tão duros, né? Para nós, para as universidades brasileiras, para a ciência, para a cultura, né? Então, um evento dessa magnitude aí, que se propõe a discutir assuntos que envolvem filosofia, arte, literatura, cultura, cinema, né? Enfim, tudo isso é vida, né? É o que a gente precisa para esse país nesse momento, mais que nunca. Então, eu desejo muito sucesso para esse evento, porque é mais uma iniciativa para a gente se fortalecer e para fortalecer nossos laços e nossas esperanças aí, né? Então, de fato, muito importante que a gente permaneça vivo, fazendo esse tipo de iniciativa, e estaremos aí, né? Unidos até todos sempre, defendendo a universidade pública, o direito de todos a frequentar a universidade pública. E é isso, quero agradecer novamente, dizer que é de fato um prazer e uma honra a parceria da UFMG, da Fafiche, com a Federal de Uberlândia, e receber todos os palestrantes, todos os estudantes, né, todos os participantes desse evento. Parabenizá-los novamente, a organização, porque não é fácil organizar um evento, né, e desejar muitos frutos positivos durante esses dias, esses momentos aí para vocês. Obrigada, gente.
Muito obrigada, professora Thais. Eu passo, então, a palavra agora à Júlia, professora atualmente da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia e egressa, com louvor, muitos louvores, da UFMG, da Faculdade de Letras, que também é uma coorganizadora, né? As pessoas da Sandra Bianchi e do Rodrigo Gonçalves, que é do Paraná, mas que está atualmente fazendo um pós-doutorado aqui e que também é organizador. Júlia, por gentileza.
A todos e todas. Agradeço aos diretores pelas palavras de acolhida, agradeço ao público, né, pela presença, e aos meus colegas co-organizadores desse evento, Cecília, Rodrigo, Sandra, Rubens. Queria dizer que, para mim, é uma grande honra estar aqui como organizadora dessa 10ª edição do simpósio, porque eu participei das edições anteriores, na época que eu fazia pós-graduação, como monitora, né, do evento. Então, para mim, é uma grande alegria agora, né, como professora, participar dessa organização e poder, com isso, aprofundar os laços, né, e as parcerias entre a UFO e a UFMG. A gente tem feito várias ações, né, de extensão, em formato online, em parceria, então é uma grande alegria para mim isso. E queria agradecer também ao aceite de todos os palestrantes e moderadores que tanto vão enriquecer o nosso evento ao longo desses 3 dias, né, e agradecer também ao apoio inestimável da equipe de monitores, né, que tem nos auxiliado muito com as questões técnicas, com detalhes para a organização que são de imensa importância. Então, com isso, eu dou as boas-vindas a todos e todas, sem me delongar mais, e passo a palavra para a Cecília para que nós possamos iniciar, então, essa 10ª edição do simpósio com o tema Metamorphoses e Metamorphoses.
Obrigada, Júlia. Mais uma vez eu agradeço a todos, em particular aos 3 palestrantes que farão a abertura, né, na mesa 1, primeira sessão. Então, a professora Jacqueline Fabre-Serris, de Lille, o professor Yiannis Petropoulos, da Universidade da Trace, Democritus, na Trace, e o professor Frederick. Eu só gostaria de brevemente mencionar aqui, né, a presença de um professor muito querido da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. Com ele, eu organizei o 3º simpósio, em Florianópolis ainda. Esse simpósio teve 3 edições em Santa Catarina, quando eu era professora lá, e o 3º, sobre o Padre Vieira, foi organizado com o professor João Batista Lupe, que está aqui, então, como representante dessa primeira fase, né? E quando eu vim para o UFMG, eu fui muito bem acolhida, e com o professor Marcelo Marques, né, muito querido, de saudosa memória, eu planejei a organização em que o professor Teodoro deu enorme apoio também, e Montes Claros. Foi a primeira edição aqui em Minas Gerais desse simpósio. Então, houve essa metamorfose, digamos, né, na passagem de Santa Catarina para Minas Gerais, e desde então, a proposta que eu fiz foi que fizéssemos sempre no interior do estado, e que a UFMG pudesse estar em parceria, em contato com outras universidades, principalmente aquelas onde havia egressos, né, nossos, tanto da letras, do NEAN, e também da filosofia. E assim ele foi feito em Diamantina, Montes Claros, Ouro Preto, Viçosa, Tiradentes, né? E essa proposta de internacionalização e regionalização ao mesmo tempo, né? A localização nessas diferentes cidades e a experiência de parcerias entre professores mais experientes e menos experientes, né? Foi sempre muito saudável, produtiva, né? E agora, nesse evento comemorativo, vocês podem ler mais sobre todos os outros e as atividades também envolvidas nele, mas o histórico e essa proposta de estudos de recepção e da presença também do passado, né, no presente, e no diálogo, na verdade, né, de mão dupla. Então, eu fico muito feliz que nesse 10º evento possa ser realizada com uma estudante, né, que eu conheci na graduação ainda na UFMG, que é a Júlia, né, e agora somos colegas, na verdade sempre fomos, né, mas ela é professora na universidade com que, então, temos o prazer de partilhar, né, essa cooperação. Então, agradeço a todos e todas mais uma vez, passo a palavra para o meu colega, professor Teodoro Assunção, que vai apresentar os 3 palestrantes e dar início, então, a essa primeira sessão. Um bom simpósio a todos e todas, e obrigada mais uma vez pela presença.
Oi. Bom, eu agradeço também o convite, eu participei de algumas versões, né, episódios dessa série, e, enfim, eu não queria me delongar muito, só lembrar, né, o que foi o modelo proposto pela Cecília, que, então, os 3, primeiro, né, apresentassem as suas posições. Ela sugeriu até 25 minutos, pode ser um pouquinho mais, um pouquinho menos, não tem problema, e deixando, então, a discussão para o final. I think that I could speak in English. You will have all 25 minutes or 30 minutes, and we will make the discussion after all the expositions, okay? E a única coisa que eu acho que fica um pouco mais interessante dessa forma seria que eu apresentasse brevemente cada palestrante antes de sua fala, e não os 3 de uma vez, porque a memória, né, dessa pequena mini biografia acadêmica, eu acho que vai ser mais difícil assim. Então, eu vou começar, apresentando brevemente a Jacqueline Fabre-Serris, que é professora da Universidade de Lille 3, na França, e especialista em Roma Antiga, literatura, mitos e estudos de gênero. Suas obras centram-se na forma como os romanos refletiram e debateram a crise política, ideológica, moral e cultural que resultou das conquistas e do seu confronto com os reinos helenísticos. Fabre-Serris é membro do Conselho do Departamento de Humanidades, Humanité. Ela também é coeditora das revistas acadêmicas Dictina, é uma revista digital, já tem um tempo, que publica contribuições sobre literatura e cultura clássicas, e Eugesta, que analisa a literatura e a sociedade greco-romana através de uma lente de gênero. Entre seus livros, eu destacarei o que é uma versão da tese de doutorado, Mito e Poésie dans la Métamorphose d'Ovid, é o objeto mesmo do seminário, Fonction et signification de la mythologie dans la Rome augustéenne, publicada então em 1995 pela Klinksik. E é um pouco mais recente, de 2008, publicado pela Septentrion, que é a presse universitaire aí de Lille, Rome, l'Arcadie et la mer des Argonautes. Essai sur la naissance d'une mythologie des origines en Occident. Alors, Jacqueline, c'est à toi de parler. C'est un immense plaisir de te revoir, de t'écouter. Ton érudition m'a toujours fasciné.
Merci beaucoup. J'avais demandé s'il était possible de partager l'écran puisque je parle en français. Est-ce qu'on peut... moi, j'ai mon texte. Est-ce qu'on peut partager l'écran, projeter le texte? Si vous m'autorisez à partager l'écran, je...
Nájila, tem como liberar para a Jacqueline, por favor, partilhamento da tela?
Claro.
Eu acho que para acompanhar em francês vai ser melhor mesmo, tendo acesso ao texto.
Si je peux avoir... Moi, j'ai le texte. Si vous me donnez le partage d'écran, je peux projeter mon texte. Parce que je ne l'ai pas autrement, de toute façon. Je ne l'ai pas tiré puisque j'avais demandé à le projeter. Donc, je ne l'ai pas du tout. Il peut être que sur l'écran. Donc, il faut que vous me donniez le partage d'écran.
Jacqueline, tu es déjà co-host, donc tu peux partager l'écran si tu veux.
Je peux? Ok, super. Alors, c'est bon? Vous l'avez?
Oui.
D'accord. Ok, donc je vais le lire en même temps.
Est-ce que tu peux faire du zoom, s'il vous plaît?
L'augmenter un peu, plus gros.
Oui, augmenter un peu.
Comme ça?
Oui, ok.
Ça va?
Ça va.
Ok. Merci. Merci beaucoup. C'est un plaisir de revoir Teodoro, puis de vous voir tous, puisque j'étais venue 2 fois à Belo Horizonte il y a longtemps. Bon, je vais commencer donc. Le projet qu'Ovid expose dans les 4 premiers vers des Métamorphoses, dire les changements de forme, des origines du monde jusqu'à son époque, a été mis en relation avec le discours attribué au livre 15 à Pythagore, qui fournirait un arrière-plan philosophique à son époque sur le changement incessant des formes dans le monde. C'est une tradition dans la poésie épique latine que d'inclure un développement philosophique plus ou moins important. C'est le cas avec le discours d'Homère, apparu en songe à Ennius dans les Annales, et avec le discours d'Anchise rencontré aux Enfers par Énée chez Virgile. Depuis l'article séminal de Philippe Hardy en 1995, la teneur du discours philosophique du livre 15 a été réévaluée. Le philosophe auquel Ovide se réfère serait en fait Empédocle. À la suite de cet article de Philippe Hardy, qui lui-même faisait suite à ses analyses dans Cosmos and Imperium, une série de travaux menés par Philippe Hardy, Damien Ellis, Joseph Farrell, Dondra O'Rourke, Alex Hardy et moi-même ont mis en évidence l'existence d'une tradition poétique renvoyant à Empédocle, constituée par Homère allégorisé, l'épisode des Amours de Mars et de Vénus, Apollonios de Rhodes, Ennius, Lucrèce, Virgile, Horace, les élégiaques, Ovide, dans les Métamorphoses et Lucas. Après avoir rappelé, sans trop entrer dans les détails, comment Ovide s'est référé à Empédocle et à sa théorie sur les deux forces qui seraient à l'œuvre dans le monde et dont la domination alternerait sans cesse, l'une d'union et de cohésion, philia, l'autre de désunion et de destruction, naikos, j'essaierai de montrer que la théorisation du phénomène de la métamorphose, qu'on peut reconnaître dans le discours de Pythagore, sur le changement des formes par transformation et renouvellement successif, rien ne concerne son apparence propre et la nature qui renouvelle toute chose à partir de figures différentes en crée d'autres, peut éclairer la façon même dont Ovide conçoit l'écriture des histoires mythologiques. D'une façon générale, en effet, et indépendamment de la thématique particulière qu'il a choisie, les récits de métamorphose, chaque version d'une histoire mythologique est une variation sur des versions précédentes qu'elle reprend en les modifiant. J'axerai mon analyse de la façon dont Ovide raconte ces histoires mythologiques avec variation d'une histoire à l'autre, en prenant pour objet le cycle éclaté sur les amours des dieux. Enfin, j'essaierai de montrer que la façon dont Ovide construit ses récits a un effet sur leur lecture, elle aussi soumise à des changements d'interprétation. Je prendrai l'exemple d'un autre cycle, le chant d'Orphée, amorcé par un passage programmatique qui donne le sens de l'ensemble, sens remis ensuite en question au cours de la lecture. Donc, en quoi les métamorphoses sont-elles conçues comme un épos empédocléen? Ce qui ressort aussi des 4 premiers vers des Métamorphoses, c'est qu'Ovide a eu un modèle poétique pour le choix de son sujet. Le verbe dédouquiter, dans l'expression perpetuum dédouquiter Carmen, a été reconnu comme renvoyant à la bucolique 6, où Virgile illustre l'injonction adressée par Apollon à Tityre de dire un déductum Carmen par le chant qu'il attribue ensuite à Silène. Or, les métamorphoses peuvent être mises en relation avec ce chant pour ce qui est de leur structure. Le chant de Silène commence par une cosmogonie, renvoyant à la fois à Lucrèce avec le vide et les atomes, et à Empédocle, avec la mention des 4 éléments et l'usage d'une technique typique du style d'Empédocle, l'évocation de ces 4 éléments sous la forme de leur manifestation dans la nature. S'y ajoute surtout le fait que son amorce, Namque Canebat, a été reconnu comme calqué sur Eidendos, dans les Argonautiques chant 1, et renvoie au chant cosmogonique d'Orphée chez Apollonios de Rhodes, où la naissance de l'univers est présentée comme résultant d'une séparation des éléments sous l'effet de la discorde, neikos, le principe qui, dans le système cosmique empédocléen, est opposé à l'amour. Après ce début cosmogonique, Silène évoque diverses histoires mythologiques, dont certaines se concluent sur une métamorphose. Je n'entrerai pas dans les détails de ce champ complexe sur le plan intertextuel, avec au centre un éloge de Gallus. Plusieurs de ces histoires peuvent être mises en relation avec l'alternance empédocléenne, amour-union, et séparation, colère-haine. Dans sa cosmogonie au livre 1, où il se réfère aussi à Lucrèce, Ovide mentionne 3 des 4 éléments empédocléens et utilise dans sa description du mélange qu'ils auraient formé à l'origine le terme discordia, qui est considéré comme la transcription latine du naikos d'Empédocle, des semences de choses mal liées du fait de la discorde, puis l'expression corcordipaquet, qui renvoie au principe inverse, philia, donc traduit par concordia en latin, il est lié après les avoir séparés dans des espaces différents par la concorde et la paix. Après cette cosmogonie, Ovide alterne des récits épico-héroïques et des récits érotiques. La première histoire érotique racontée faisant suite à un exploit guerrier. Apollon, vainqueur du monstre Python, est vaincu par le pouvoir de Cupidon, mais son amour n'aboutit pas à l'union escomptée. Daphné lui échappe grâce à une métamorphose. Dans la suite de son texte, Ovide répond doublement à l'usage que Virgile fait d'Empédocle dans l'Énéide. Virgile présente une vision négative de l'amour, alors je renvoie d'autres études, mais je le fais, il n'y a pas de note là, avec le fureur de Didon, se retournant quand Aîné l'abandonne, en haine et colère, avec une annonce des guerres puniques, c'est ce qu'a montré Damien Ellis, et une théorie sur la purgation des passions par les éléments dans le discours d'Anchises. Au chant 6, il loue Auguste pour avoir étendu les limites de l'impérium à celles du monde, et au chant 8, il décrit la bataille d'Axione comme un choc cosmique où s'affrontent des forces de destruction liées à Mars, qui correspond à Naïkos, et d'union, incarnée par Vénus, qui correspond donc à l'amour, lesquels triomphent avec la reddition de toutes les nations, désormais soumises au pouvoir d'Auguste, et unies dans la Pax Romana avec une équivalence amour-pax. Ovide répond par une autre conception de l'extension du domaine de Philia. Au livre 5, il met en scène Vénus, demandant à son fils d'accroître l'impérium de l'amour en rendant le dieu des enfers amoureux de Proserpine. Dans le discours de Pythagore, il s'oppose à la vision virgilienne du cosmos stabilisé grâce à l'imperium romanum, dont la progression serait le signe de la victoire de Philia. Le philosophe révèle que la loi de l'univers consiste dans un changement incessant des formes, et il prend entre autres exemples celui de la fortune des lieux, en soulignant que le pouvoir des États ne dure pas, ce qui laisse supposer que Rome, la cité, dit-il, dont la puissance monte, connaîtra le même sort que l'Asie et la Grèce. Sans développer davantage, je passe maintenant à ma deuxième partie, la théorie d'Empédocle sur la mutation incessante des formes et l'écriture des histoires de métamorphoses. Comme l'a noté Philippe Hardy, le Pythagore, plutôt empédocléen d'Ovide, est aussi par bien des aspects une figure du poète Ovide lui-même. On peut donc, sans surprise, trouver des correspondances entre la théorie d'Empédocle sur les formes changeantes du monde et la pratique narrative d'Ovide, correspondances qui ne sont pas sans avoir d'effet sur l'interprétation que les lecteurs peuvent faire de ces récits. Je commence par une observation générale. Les mythes antiques n'existent que sous la forme de récits ou de représentations figurées, qui diffèrent toutes entre elles, chaque auteur ou artiste en offrant une version différente. Chaque récit d'un même mythe est constitué de séquences et motifs qu'il partage avec d'autres récits, mais qui ne sont jamais tout à fait les mêmes dans leur contenu, dans leur ordre et dans leur mise en relation. Et il en possède aussi certaines qui lui sont propres. C'est par exemple chez Euripide que pour la première fois, Médée est présentée comme la meurtrière de ses enfants. C'est un trait caractéristique de la Médée d'Euripide. Si j'arrive à descendre. Comme on l'a observé, à l'exception des auteurs d'épopées et de tragédies, les poètes se réfèrent en général aux histoires mythologiques en s'en servant comme d'exemplats, et donc en se contentant de faire allusion à tel motif ou épisode. Dans les Métamorphoses, Ovide, lui, raconte les histoires mythologiques sous la forme d'épisodes successifs narrés en détail. J'ai dans des articles antérieurs défendu l'hypothèse qu'il avait été influencé par la pratique narratologique, tout à fait novatrice, mise en place par Parthénios de Nicée, un poète grec, qui dédie au poète romain Gallus, le fondateur de l'élégie érotique, un recueil de 27 histoires mythologiques, rassemblées en fonction d'une topique commune, susceptible d'intéresser Gallus, des Erotica Pathemata. Parthénios explique dans son envoi à Gallus qu'il racontait ces histoires sous la forme de résumés détaillés, de façon à ce que ce dernier en saisisse les principaux éléments et puisse les utiliser comme exemplaires dans ses propres textes poétiques. L'analyse de sa pratique narrative révèle que Parthénios raconte chacun des récits, alors je renvoie des études narratologiques, enfin je renvoie faites sur Parthénios, relevant d'une thématique majeure commune, inceste ou adultère par exemple, sous la forme de diverses séquences correspondant chacune à un moment de l'action qui, si on les compare entre elles, sont soit les mêmes, soit inversées. Si on prend l'exemple des récits d'inceste, celui-ci peut être imposé ou consenti, consciemment pratiqué ou ignoré par l'un des partenaires, mais généralement vécu dans le secret. Il peut être pratiqué sans trouble, jusqu'à une révélation subite, et peut donner lieu, lors de sa révélation, à une réaction violente, conclue ou pas par une fin tragique, qui n'atteint pas toujours le même partenaire, homme, femme, celui qui l'a imposé ou celui qui le subit. Ovide a repris cette pratique narrative dans les Métamorphoses, où doublant son choix thématique de raconter des métamorphoses, il rassemble sous forme de cycle des récits relevant de diverses autres thématiques, que ce cycle soit éclaté ou se présente comme un ensemble d'histoires racontées à la suite. Je prendrai pour exemple le cycle éclaté sur les amours des dieux, en prenant ce titre à Virgile, qui à propos du chant de Clyménée, parle des amours innombrables des dieux depuis le chaos, d'un sos amores. Ce cycle consiste en une série d'histoires de filles qui sont vues, désirées, et à ce désir immédiatement exprimé par le dieu, oppose un refus et ou une fuite. Cette série a pour héroïne Daphné, Io, Syrinx au livre 1, Callisto, Cornyx au livre 2, Méduse au livre 4, Proserpine et Aréthuse au livre 5 et Scylla au livre 13. Dans tous ces récits, il y a une constante, une séquence constante. Le refus masculin est refusé par la potentielle partenaire féminine. Et d'autres séquences et motifs partagés seulement par certains récits qui sont similaires aux présences des divergences. Donc, il y a des changements. Ovid indique par exemple que certaines des filles refusent le mariage, Daphné, Syrinx, Scylla, ou ne tissent pas la laine, Callisto, ou passent leur temps à chasser, sont les compagnes de Diane, Syrinx, Callisto et Aréthuse. Il est parfois fait mention de leur chevelure, qu'elles ne soignent pas, Daphné, mais qui attise le désir masculin, Méduse, en particulier quand elle fuit, Daphné. Leur corps est vêtu, mais peut-être dévoilé. Quand la brise plaque sur lui ses vêtements, Daphné, ou nue, lorsqu'Aréthuse et Scylla nagent. Quand elles sont approchées par un homme qui exprime son désir d'union immédiate, ces jeunes filles rougissent, Daphné fuit, Daphné, Syrinx, Cornyx, Aréthuse, celui-là, ou luttent, Callisto, pour garder leur virginité. Certaines sont violées, Callisto, Méduse, d'autres sauvées du viol par une métamorphose, Daphné, Syrinx, Aréthuse, Cornyx, ou luttent en vain, Callisto, ou subissent ultérieurement une métamorphose vengeance, Callisto est puni par Diane pour avoir fauté, Scylla, qui a échappé à Glaucus, est ensuite victime de la jalousie de Circé. Plusieurs de ces histoires mettent l'accent sur le fait que les jeunes filles ont fait un choix identitaire, vivent en compagnie d'autres femmes, Syrinx, Callisto, et préfèrent cette compagnie à celle des hommes, Callisto, Scylla. Avec ces diverses séquences et motifs qui sont en partie partagés, en partie propres à chaque histoire, donc pour le lecteur, soumis à des changements, Ovide explore les raisons pour lesquelles ces filles sont désirées et leurs réactions diverses quand elles sont confrontées à des avances sexuelles, refus, lutte ou fuite, en même temps qu'il décrit souvent leur peur et leur souffrance. L'ensemble met en évidence ce que le motif des amours des dieux, si fréquent dans la mythologie, recouvre, si l'on se place aussi du point de vue des femmes, une violence à laquelle elles essaient en vain d'échapper. Ce cycle éclaté permet de revenir de livre en livre et offre la possibilité de débattre sur la question des relations sexuelles auxquelles les femmes sont forcées, en offrant un certain nombre de variantes de cette même situation qui mettent l'accent sur tel élément ou tel autre, par exemple l'attractivité exercée par le corps féminin, alors même que les filles ne cherchent pas à plaire. Au livre 6, le lecteur trouve un condensé de toutes ces histoires dans la tapisserie d'Arachné, dont le sens général en relation avec le contexte, la rivalité entre une mortelle et une déesse, est une mise en accusation du comportement des dieux envers les hommes, alors que la déesse, elle, cherche à mettre en évidence l'attitude bienveillante des dieux envers les hommes. Pallas se décrit en effet, rivalisant dans les bienfaits avec Poséidon, pour gagner la reconnaissance des Athéniens et devenir leur divinité tutélaire. Dans la toile d'Arachné, chacun des dieux est représenté sous la forme humaine, animale, végétale ou matérielle, qu'il a prise pour approcher une femme à laquelle il fait violence. Les partenaires, les circonstances, les métamorphoses changent. Sur fond d'une constante générale, les dieux usent de tromperie et de violence pour assouvir leurs désirs sexuels. Dans cette série, chaque histoire est réduite à une seule séquence, celle où le dieu métamorphosé contraint une femme, à l'inverse des récits du cycle éclaté, où chaque histoire, racontée plus en détail, met en valeur les aspirations personnelles et les réactions des victimes féminines des dieux. Variation narrative et mouvance de la lecture. Quand les cycles ne sont pas éclatés, mais en continu, l'effet que cette pratique narrative, avec variation de séquences et motifs, a sur le sens à la fois de chaque histoire et de l'ensemble, sont plus importants encore. Je vais prendre l'exemple du cycle d'Orphée, au début duquel ce dernier énonce un programme en 2 parties, l'une consacrée à des garçons qui furent choisis, chéris par les dieux, Dilectis, enfin c'est Dilectos, je crois, c'est pas Dilectis, et l'autre à des jeunes filles frappées par des feux interdits qui, du fait de leur désir amoureux déréglé, méritèrent d'être punies. Si la passivité des mortels, garçons et filles, est un motif commun à ces histoires, à ces catégories d'histoires, ces 2 catégories d'histoires érotiques, la mention d'une juste punition, mérouissée des filles, résultant de leur libido excessive, à la fois oriente la lecture sur le plan moral, mais suscite une question. Si elle est provoquée, pourquoi cette libido serait-elle un élément à charge dans le cas des filles, où l'élément prévalent est-il la notion d'interdit? La lecture successive des histoires racontées par Orphée va accroître ces questionnements. La première histoire, racontée sous la forme d'un résumé, celle de Ganymède, correspond exactement au programme d'Orphée. Tombé amoureux de Ganymède, Jupiter se métamorphose en aigle, l'enlève et Ganymède est depuis les chansons des dieux. La seconde histoire, celle d'Hyacinthe, chérie par Apollon, correspond aussi à ce programme. Apollon a tant chéri Hyacinthe qu'il l'aurait également placée dans les cieux. Mais cette séquence est absente de l'histoire d'Hyacinthe et remplacée par la mort de ce dernier et sa métamorphose en fleur par le dieu en proie à un profond désespoir. Hyacinthe est mort en effet au cours d'une partie de jeu, frappé par le rebond du disque lancé par le dieu. Cet incident introduit deux autres motifs, celui de la faute involontaire et celui de la douleur excessive du protagoniste divin, motifs que cette histoire partage avec celle d'Orphée, responsable par amour de la seconde mort d'Eurydice, et qui lui aussi s'abîma dans le chagrin. Ces deux nouveaux motifs orientent donc vers un second type de lecture, consistant à confronter les amours racontés par Orphée avec l'expérience personnelle que ce dernier fit de la passion, expérience qui fut sanctionnée parce que le fureur amoureux l'emporta sur la piétas. C'est en tout cas le point de vue de Virgile dans les Géorgiques. Ici, Ovide, en tant que narrateur principal, il faut toujours prendre en compte le fait qu'il y a deux auteurs, Ovide est le personnage secondaire qui fait parler, et que les références intertextuelles sont imputables seulement à Ovide, répond à Virgile avec cette question d'Apollon, destinée à faire réfléchir le lecteur. Quelle est ma faute? Se demande Apollon, à moins que ce ne soit une faute de jouer et une faute d'aimer. Chez Virgile, Eurydice incriminait son trop ardent amant. Quelle est cette folie? Furor, donc, qui m'a perdu et t'a perdu, Orphée. Donc, c'est manifestement une faute d'aimer chez Virgile. L'histoire suivante, celle des Propétides, relève de la seconde partie du programme d'Orphée. Elle est précédée d'une histoire d'Impiétas. Les Cérastes, qui immolaient leurs hôtes sur l'autel de Jupiter hospitalier, furent transformés par Vénus en monstres cordus. La déesse punit aussi, en les changeant en pierre, les Propétides, qui avaient osé nier sa divinité et qui en outre se prostituaient, ce qui ajoute au motif de l'impiétas celui du manquement au pouls d'or. Cette histoire en entraîne une autre, dans la mesure où le comportement des Propétides provoque chez le sculpteur Pygmalion les décisions de vivre sans épouse. Cependant, il sculpte une statue d'une beauté merveilleuse qui imite la nature au point qu'il ne lui manque que d'être animé, ce que Pygmalion demande à mots couverts à Vénus lors de la fête en son honneur. Il obtient gain de cause en raison de sa piétas et se trouve ainsi pourvu d'une épouse pudique. Les séquences témoignant d'une impiété et ou d'une piété sont ainsi alternées d'une histoire à une autre. C'est avec l'histoire de la petite fille de Pygmalion Mira qu'Orphée renoue avec son programme initial. Victime d'une des trois furies, Mira ressent de l'amour pour son père, amour qu'elle s'efforce de combattre, puis qui sera réalisé grâce à l'aide de sa nourrice. Cette histoire d'inceste apparemment relève pleinement de la seconde partie du programme. Mira, frappée par des feux interdits, mérita d'être punie. Mais est-ce vraiment le cas? Dans le monologue où elle analyse son furor, Mira, ou plutôt Ovide, attribue finalement ces feux interdits à une forme d'excès de piétas. Elle aime trop son père, en même temps qu'est contestée l'idée que l'inceste est un amour interdit sur le plan naturel, les animaux s'y livrent, chez les dieux, ils le pratiquent, l'inceste, et partout chez les hommes, il est pratiqué chez certains peuples, chez qui la piétas se double d'un amoureux désir. Mais cette contestation est aussi possible si l'on fait jouer les séquences des histoires successives entre elles. Pygmalion crée une statue qui est comme sa fille, et Vénus lui permet de l'épouser en raison de sa piétas à son égard à elle, tandis que Mira tombe amoureuse de son père et sera punie pour avoir pu satisfaire son désir, même si celui-ci lui a été imposé. Quant à la question de sa piétas ou de son impiétas, elle est diversement jugée par son père, la divinité qui la métamorphose, Lucine qui l'aide à accoucher et les naïades qui recueillent l'enfant. Sans compter évidemment les lecteurs, à qui la complexité du récit permet d'en débattre et de se faire leurs propres opinions. Si l'on en reste aux séquences et motifs que l'on trouve dans chacune des histoires, on remarque que l'histoire suivante est comme celle de Pygmalion, un inceste masqué. Vénus tombe amoureuse d'Adonis, dont il est dit quelques vers plus tôt qu'il est le sosie de l'amour, et elle éprouve cette passion après avoir été touchée par une flèche dépassant du carquois de son fils. Pourquoi l'inceste n'est-il condamné que dans le cas de Mira? Au cours d'une chasse, en compagnie d'Adonis, pour le mettre en garde contre les animaux sauvages, Vénus lui raconte l'histoire d'Atalante, une fille qui, sous la pulsion d'un désir interdit, commit une impiétasse et fut transformée, en même temps que son amant, en lion. Après la mort d'Adonis, tué par un sanglier, Vénus sombre dans une douleur extrême et transforme le corps du jeune homme en fleur, un comportement qu'elle partage donc avec Apollon après la mort d'Hyacinthe. Pour résumer, l'organisation narrative du chant d'Orphée est complexe, du fait qu'elle consiste en un assemblage d'histoires que l'auteur Ovide a choisi de raconter sous la forme d'une combinaison de séquences et motifs qui changent en partie d'une histoire à l'autre, ce qui incite son lecteur à les comparer entre elles. D'un côté, un certain nombre de séquences et motifs qui rappellent l'histoire d'Orphée proposent une réévaluation des rapports entre Furore et Pietas, dont Virgile avait cherché à mettre en évidence l'antagonisme, selon lui, irréductible dans les Géorgiques 4. Les récits rassemblés dans le chant d'Orphée mettent en question tout jugement négatif sur la conduite qui résulte du Furore. Des dieux aussi ont aimé, commis involontairement des fautes, cédé au désespoir le plus profond, à la mort de l'être aimé, et voulu perpétuer leur marque de douleur. Le récit consacré au cas le plus frappant, peut-être, de feu interdit l'inceste, révèle dans l'origine de ce sentiment une proximité inattendue entre Pietas et Furore. L'encadrement narratif de l'histoire de Mira relativise encore le bien fondé d'une condamnation sans appel, en suggérant de reconnaître des variantes d'inceste camouflées, favorisées ou pratiquées par Vénus, dans l'amour d'un homme pour une jeune fille dont il est le créateur, ou d'une femme pour un jeune homme qui ressemble à son fils. D'un récit à l'autre, Ovide a ainsi mis en place un jeu de similitudes et de différentes, dont de mutations de motifs ou de séquences, jeu qui est manifestement conçu à l'usage d'un lecteur attentif, dont le jugement alerté par le programme énoncé au début du chant, et plus particulièrement par le déséquilibre entre les effets des amours imposés aux deux sexes, se construit au fur et à mesure de la progression de sa lecture, voire de façon rétroactive. L'exemple le plus probant est peut-être la dernière histoire, celle d'Atalante, qui rebat toutes les cartes thématiques du cycle. Que trouve en effet le lecteur dans cette histoire? De la Pietas. Sous l'effet de sa passion amoureuse, Hippomène sollicite l'aide de Vénus, puis de l'impiétas. Du fait de cette même passion, Hippomène oublie de remercier la déesse et Vénus, suscitant en eux un désir intempestif. Hippomène et Atalante commettent une impiété à l'égard d'une autre divinité, Cybèle, qui les punit immédiatement. Mais est-ce que pour autant, l'héroïne Atalante est un bon exemple de fille frappée par des feux interdits qui mérita d'être punie du fait de son désir déréglé? On peut se demander si elle ne fut pas plutôt une victime. Vouée par un oracle imprécis à une destinée malheureuse, le mariage lui interdit sous peine d'une métamorphose punition. Elle essaie en vain de suivre cet oracle en imposant à ses prétendants une épreuve dans laquelle ils ne peuvent triompher, mais ne peut échapper à son destin, ce que lui avait également annoncé l'oracle, à partir du moment où Hippomène reçoit l'aide de Vénus et où Atalante tombe amoureuse, devenant ainsi passive. Elle est finalement englobée dans la punition qu'a méritée Hippomène, coupable comme Orphée de trop d'amour et auteur de ce fait d'une première impiété. Il oublie comme Orphée ce que la pietas impliquait, dans son cas remercier la déesse. Cette première impiété en déclenche une seconde, à laquelle participe Atalante. Un désir imposé, allumé par Vénus, pousse les deux amants à une union sexuelle immédiate, pour laquelle Hippomène entraîne Atalante dans un lieu sacré, à proximité duquel il se trouve alors. Atalante était-elle donc coupable ou victime? La réponse change selon que le lecteur prend en compte tel ou tel détail dans la succession des épisodes. Ce processus est à l'œuvre dans l'ensemble du cycle constitué par le chant d'Orphée. Alors même qu'un jugement moral préalable, induit par le Méruissé, était censé devoir être conforté par la lecture des différentes histoires impliquant des jeunes filles, en raison des mouvances dans leurs éléments narratifs, la série des histoires engage leur lecteur à les relire, en pratiquant un va-et-vient entre chaque histoire et celle qui la précède ou la suivent, et à débattre avec lui-même ou avec d'autres lecteurs sur ce que toute lecture implique, l'interprétation des textes. On a souvent parlé de l'extrême ingéniosité d'Ovide pour la louer ou pour la déplorer, comme si elle était gratuite. Il ressort clairement de la construction narrative et thématique du chant d'Orphée que cette ingéniosité est à relier à sa volonté de mettre en question une conception simple de la morale. Loin de chercher dans les mythes des leçons univoques, comme celle énoncée par le musicien Thrace, une fille qui vit des amours interdites, même si elles lui ont été imposées, mérite d'être punie, Ovide fournit à son lecteur la possibilité de débattre des questions morales, ici la sexualité des femmes, à partir de la façon dont ce dernier prendra en compte et fera jouer entre eux divers éléments narratifs qui, de fait qu'ils changent d'une histoire à l'autre, l'incitent à conforter les histoires mythologiques entre elles. Le sens de chaque récit, ou plutôt ses sens, ne peuvent résulter que des rapports complexes que ce récit entretient, alors non seulement avec les récits du reste des métamorphoses, mais aussi avec d'autres textes d'Ovide et avec d'autres textes d'autres poètes. Bon, ça c'est une question plus vaste. Rapports mouvants, qui ont changé et continuent de changer avec le temps. Je vous remercie. Et j'enlève. Alors, je ne sais plus comment je fais pour.
Merci beaucoup, Jacqueline.
Comment je fais pour enlever ça? Comment est-ce que j'enlève mon. J'ai peur de me déconnecter complètement si je fais ça. Bon, je vais essayer. Je le vois. Voilà, ça va, c'est bon.
Ah oui, c'est bon.
J'ai juste enlevé le type.
Alors, je te remercie beaucoup. C'est passionnant exposé. Tu as été ponctuel. Alors, on va laisser... En fait, c'est une lecture rapide, hein, mais avec le texte là, je crois qu'il a été possible de te suivre. Mais on va laisser... Oui, mais très bien, hein, mais on va laisser les questions pour... Après.
Très bien, après, parfait.
Plus tard.
Oui, plus tard, très bien.
OK. Et je vais tout de suite présenter Yiannis Petropoulos. Enfin, c'est une brève présentation aussi. Uma apresentação breve, eu vou retomar aqui o português. Então, já começando, né, dizendo que ele fez sua formação na Faculdade de Direito, na Universidade de Atenas, na Grécia, na Universidade de Harvard, nos Estados Unidos, e na Universidade de Oxford, na Inglaterra. Ele ensinou literatura grega antiga em Oxford por vários anos, antes de se estabelecer na Grécia em 1990. Desde então, ele lecionou na Universidade de Creta, na Universidade Democritus da Trácia e na Universidade Aberta Helênica. Ele também lecionou em universidades no Brasil, China, União Europeia, Reino Unido e Estados Unidos da América. É professor de literatura grega antiga no Departamento de Filologia Grega na Universidade Democritus da Trácia, professor adjunto de clássicas no Seminário Teológico Ortodoxo São Fótios, em Etna, e diretor emérito do Center for Hellenic Studies, né, na Grécia. Entre os livros, vou destacar Kleos in a Minor Key, The Homeric Education of a Little Prince, publicado em 2011 pelo Center for Hellenic Studies e a Harvard University Press. E aqui, né, um próximo livro anunciado, eu não achei indicação direta da publicação ainda, como sendo, então, para 2021, The Gospel and the Greeks, Case Studies in the Reception of Ancient Greek Literature in Early Church. Yiannis, I thank you
Eu agradeço.
for your presence here, and the talk is yours.
Okay.
Now, okay. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you a lot.
Okay. Well, bom dia a todos. Queria agradecer, como todo fortemente queria agradecer o convite e a honra. Sempre é uma honra para mim falar, palestrar no Brasil, mesmo hoje mesmo. Me acho fora de minha área de minha especialidade hoje. Vou me transformar, então, em leitor diletante de Ovídio. E, portanto, peço desculpas em antecipação. Agradeço a equipe de UFMG, especialmente a professora Cecília e toda a equipe. So, without further ado now, in a language which I can speak, I'd like to begin with a long passage, or a longish passage, ladies and gentlemen, from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's book 4, verses 103 through 28. And I'll read the sort of workmanlike and dated translation in the Loeb edition. Arachne pictures Europa cheated by the disguise of the bull, a real bull and real waves you would think them. The maid seems to be looking back upon the land she has left, calling on her companions and fearful of the touch of the leaping waves to be drawing back her timid feet. She wrought Astere, held by the struggling eagle. She wrought Leda beneath the swan's wings. She added how in a satyr's image hidden, Jove filled lovely Antiope with twin offspring, how he was Amphitryon when he cheated the Alcmena, how in a golden shower he tricked Danae, Aegina as a flame, Mnemosyne as a shepherd, Deo's daughter as a spotted snake. Thee also Neptune she pictured, changed to a grim bull with the Aeolian maiden. Now as Enipios, you dost beget the Aloidae, as a ram deceiveth the Saltis. The golden-haired mother of corn, most gentle, knew thee as a horse. The snake-haired mother of the winged horse knew thee as a winged bird. Melantho knew thee as a dolphin. To all these Arachne gave their own shapes and appropriate surroundings. Here is Phoebus like a countryman, and she shows how he wore now a hawk's feathers, now a lion's skin, how as a shepherd he tricked Macarius's daughter, Isse, how Bacchus deceived Erigone with the false bunch of grapes, how Saturn in a horse's shape begot the centaur Chiron, the edge of the web with its narrow borders filled with flowers and clinging ivy intertwined.
Yiannis, just a minute. If you can, yes, show your text.
Oh dear.
Teodoro, quem está compartilhando é a Nájila.
Ok. É preciso descer um pouco o texto para que a gente acompanhe isso. Agora, a tradução da Loeb, ela já foi lida, é preciso descer mais um pouco para que as suas considerações, então, estejam visíveis. Eu acho que vai ser mais fácil acompanhar o inglês. É um pouco depois ainda. Pode descer mais. Isso, agora... Não. Eu acho que foi muito longe.
Aí.
Não, tá. Curiosamente, não. Eu estou achando que aqui isso está mais para o fim. Houve uma mistura, essa vária história do Aelianos é um pouco antes. Não estou entendendo a mistura.
Travando aqui um pouquinho.
A sequência seria, né? One of the Ovidian changes that most impress children.
Yes, okay. Thank you. One of the Ovidian changes that most impress children is the transformation of Arachne, as told in Metamorphoses, Book 6. The change of this working-class virgin, a spinner from Lydia, into a spider still has much to teach us about literature. Ovid's text has been plumbed by Latinists for insights into subjects from anti-Augustan poetics and female sexuality to the relation of writing to weaving and many, many more. I would like to look at the vertiginously varied tapestry of this weaver in order to correlate it to a type of wish well attested in ancient Greek subliterary sources. Arachne owed her craft and faultless artistry to Minerva, but vainly, blasphemously denied this. Disguised as a palsied old crone, the goddess promptly revealed herself to the girl, and a weaving contest ensued. Minerva produced a well-tempered series of scenes in her tapestry. The centerpiece featured the defining agone of Minerva and Neptune over Athens. The scene is capped by, or was capped by, 4 instructive exempla of punitive metamorphosis, in which mortal challengers of the gods are changed respectively into mountains, a crane, a stork, and marble steps. In her turn, Arachne wove a crowded asymmetrical composition, a patch quilt jungle of vignettes of tribally oversexed gods raping young women, men, even goddesses, and a maiden monster, Medusa. How the gods accomplish their desire is telling. They disguise themselves, shifting into animals, impersonating human beings, changing even into objects and natural phenomena such as fire and a shower of gold. And I should add that Apollo even dons a proper disguise, I think, hawk's feathers and other such. He seems to be wearing a costume. I may be wrong, but that was my impression from the Latin text. In the 26 verses of Ovid's ekphrasis of Arachne's unapologetic visual narrative, Zeus enjoys pride of place, scoring, as E.J. Kenny remarks, the highest number of disguises and sexual conquests, 9 to Neptune's 6, followed by Apollo's 4 and Bacchus's and Saturn's 1. Zeus became a gentle, playful bull, not rarely changing in essence, as a philosopher might say, but only in appearance. After gulling the Tyrian virgin princess into riding him, 103 Elusam, he rampaged across the sea, a thrusting captain of a god beneath a bull's exterior. The story is told in more detail in Book 2. In the form of an eagle, he snatched Asterie, that's 108. We are not given further details of this otherwise unknown exploit. His eagle outfit must have made it easier for him to carry out the rape. Turned into White Swan, he presumably fooled Leda, 109, and impregnated her. He impersonated Amphitryon in order to bed Alcmena, that's 112, and famously, at least to us, visited the unsuspecting Danae as a golden shower, 113. inseminating her too. Fooling Aegina outright in the form of a flame, 113, Lucerit, he achieved intercourse, and so on. Neptune becoming a bird coupled with Medusa, and in the semblance of a dolphin, seduced Melantho, verses 119 through 120. Phoebus dressed up as a shepherd to enjoy his paedica Admetus, 121 through 22. Bacchus with, and I quote, with wild bunches of false grapes deceived Erigone, 125, Deseperit. These are just highlights of the long catalogue of disguise and ravishment depicted in Arachne's handiwork. Its interest lies not only in the neat fit between many of the metamorphoses and typical attributes and associations of the rapists, for instance, the formulaic eagle of Zeus and Bacchus's trademark cluster of grapes. It is also striking that the verb deceive, to deceive, and its synonyms are used 7 times to explain some of the rapists' metamorphoses. Arachne's panorama of desire, as Ellen Oliensis calls it, illustrates a particular meaning of the Greek word metamorphosis, namely disguise. It is in this sense that the 2nd century AD Aelian, for instance, uses the verb metamorpho in the opening of his Varia Historia. So, elokossi de hoi polypodes, ketus eclus ton propon tuton, hypotas paitras kathendai, kai eautus estem ekenon metamorphosi kroian, and so forth. Octopuses also ambush fish in the following way. They sit under the rocks and change their color to match, and so they appear to be indistinguishable from the rocks. Heautus estem ekenon metamorphosi kroian. The fish then swim towards the octopuses as if they were the rocks and are caught off their guard. The octopuses entangle them in their own form of net, their tentacles. The Ovid passage I have discussed is concerned with metamorphosis, to use the Greek pronunciation, in the sense of disguise. It is a temporary, superficial change that serves as a ruse and an expedient. What better way for a god to gain contact with a resistant beloved or a favorite unaware of the deity's passion than through a cursory costume? Gods standardly disguise themselves for theological reasons, for to see a divinity in full splendor can be lethal, although, admittedly, full-scale epiphanies do occur in literature, as when earlier in this very episode, Minerva tossed off her mortal disguise to confront Arachne, enopios enopio, as the book of Genesis would say. The metamorphoses that the girl elaborates on her textile, however, are motivated by eros. They're not punitive. Amounting to wish fulfillment, they solve a practical difficulty that occurs universally in literature, folk song, and in real life, and can be summed up as, I am here, she or he is there, I passionately desire to get near to her or him. The distance and other impediments between the lover and the object of passion may be physical or not. In the case of mortals, the obstacles may make intimacy an impossibility, an adunator. What is in either event needed is a way to cross from the lovers here to the other persons or gods there. Arachne's images show up the outrageous scale and frequency with which gods are able to surmount obstacles to eros. The late psychoanalyst Georges Devreux remarked the egocentric aggressiveness of the gods. And he noted that this has earned Greek mythology a record high number of rapes as compared. In real life, mortals could and can, I suppose, could imaginatively try to overcome obstacles to love through song, as evidenced in Greek Carmina Convivialia and other subliterary sources from the 6th century BC through late antiquity. It is possible, in fact, to reconstruct a genre of love songs of metamorphoses, as I have argued elsewhere. These songs originally may have been distichs, couplets, in which a symposiast or amator exclusus in a paraklausutheron performed fantastical wishes for a metamorphosis into an animal, an object, or a natural phenomenon. By immersing himself in a might-have-been world, he could achieve sexual contact with his resistant or absent, or imaginary, I may add, beloved. Amatory reverie has always been universal and can underlie many types of lyric song across cultures and time, starting, I suppose, with the ancient Near East, and I have found such songs from ancient Egypt. I should like to conclude with a few Greek examples of love songs of metamorphosis, or metamorphoses, which can be deduced from poetry or are short poems in their own right. So I begin with the very first one on the handout. It's anonymous, it's a despoton, it was edited by Page in further Greek epigrams, but it's undateable. But it certainly dates to antiquity. If only I had become the wind, and if only going out of doors you bared your breasts and received me as I blew. Eith animos genomein sude de ste kusa par augas stethia gymnosais kai mepneonda labois. Labois, sorry. You see the speaker, the singer, fancies that he becomes, or that he could become, or regrets that he didn't become the wind, so a natural phenomenon. Meleager, 2nd century BC. This is from Hellenistic epigrams, Gow Page. Would that I were dolphin, so that carried upon my shoulder and having been ferried across, he might see roads full of sweet boys. Eth ein Delphis, hin emois bastactois homois, Porthmothes esede tan glucopida rodon. And then another example, it may not be in, I just added it at the very last minute. It's from the Anacreondaire, late antique, AD 2nd or to 4th centuries, edited by West. It's a snippet from a symphotic song, but the entire song is given over to wishing and wish fulfillment, you might say. So, Hudo telo genesthai, hopos secrota luso, muron gunai genoimein, hopos ego salepso. So he wishes he could become water so that he could bathe her skin, and the woman he addresses is presumably a heterae, and I wish I could become perfume or scent so that I could rub you down, as it were. And last but not least, something from the modern spectrum. I'll read it first in Greek. It was recorded nearly 70 years ago. Ήθελα να μουνε νερό στον ποταμό που πλύνεις και να είναι η κάψα δυνατά να σκύβεις να με πίνεις. I wish I were water in the river where you do your washing, and I wish the heat were intense and you bent down to drink me. It's a rhymed couplet. Ancient medieval and modern Greek songs and poems of metamorphosis may express delicacy or its opposite. They may be jocular or outright obscene. Set beside the Greek material, Arachne's tapestry likewise shows a panorama of desire and male fantasy. So I shall stop there.
Thank you a lot. Yiannis,
Yes.
O problema foi apenas, enfim, o de que você estava usando, né, um handout com os textos citados, mas onde o seu próprio texto, o que você estava falando, não estava aparecendo, né? Talvez, não tem problema, já foi, né? Porque a Jacqueline apresentou não só os exemplos, mas o próprio texto, porque alguns têm dificuldade de entender o inglês, mas está tranquilo, né? A gente pode deixar também as discussões, essas conexões com canções gregas, né? Isso, também esse testemunho de Eliano, né? Foram muito interessantes, mas a gente deixa as questões para depois da apresentação do Frederick, ok? Muito obrigado.
Eu agradeço.
Eu vou passar, então, a apresentação. Vai ser rápida também, de uma mini, né, biografia intelectual aqui do Frederick. Ele é, né, professor do departamento de clássicas na Universidade de Cornell, nos Estados Unidos, sendo aí o Stephen Vice Presidential Fellow. Suas áreas de pesquisa em destaque são a poesia épica, o teatro trágico, os jogos de palavras, né, wordplays, na literatura, e também a teoria da tradução. Os livros publicados são vários, eu vou citar aqui, né, e com também, né, um espectro, incluindo tanto a literatura grega antiga quanto a literatura latino-romana, né? Lucan, an introduction, uma introdução, né, a Lucan. Sêneca, Three Tragedies, Sêneca, Três Tragédias. E aqui o que está mais próximo do tema desse, né, seminário, Metaformations, Soundplay and Wordplay, in Ovid and Other Classical Poets, né? São as metaformações, jogo sonoro e jogo de palavra em Ovídio e outros poetas clássicos. Enfim, Sophocles' Oedipus, Evidence and Self-Conviction, a Statius Thebaida, a Thebaida de Estácio, a Reconsideration, e, enfim, com a parceria com a Hannah Heusman, The Odyssey Reformed, né? Frederick, the talk is yours. It's a pleasure to receive you again. You expose it for us the Aeneid of Virgil, a long exposition, the 10 books, and now you are going to talk about the wordplay in the Metamorphosis of Ovid. Okay, thank you a lot. Your sound.
Fred?
Unmute. Okay.
Muito obrigado, Teodoro. Muito obrigado, Cecília. Obrigado a todos, todas. Julia, Yiannis, Rodrigo, Martin. Muito obrigado mais uma vez pelo gentil convite a estar com vocês em Belo Horizonte, virtualmente e assim virtuosamente. Espero que todos tenham apostila com textos. Acho que seria mais fácil para todos vocês do que minhas horríveis tentativas de gerenciar uma tela.
Romana, você pode projetar o handout do Fred?
Sim.
Obrigada.
Bom dia a todos e a Cecília, Júlia, Yiannis, Rodrigo, Martim, e muito obrigado mais uma vez pelo gentil convite de estar com vocês em Belo Horizonte, virtualmente e assim virtuosamente. Espero que todos tenham a apostila com textos. Achei que seria mais fácil para todos vocês do que minhas horríveis tentativas de gerenciar uma tela.
Então, em inglês, I cannot possibly say what I'm trying to say today in any language other than English, because much of it deals with how to translate what goes on in Ovid's poetry. My theme today should be what we in the United States call a no-brainer, uma proposto infalível. That the metamorphoses described in Ovid's epic are expressed in terms of complex matrices of metrical syllabic soundplay, especially anagrams, where a word's constituent letters are juggled to create a new word, a new form. But it isn't a no-brainer, it isn't uma proposta infalível, because many scholars don't like what they find in classical and medieval texts. Personal tastes loom large among us scholars. Academics find pluralizing puns which undermine singular focused meaning, which is the very heart and soul of scholarly structure and unity. They find that particularly offensive. And translation is where disliked features of an original can be eliminated, culminating in what Haroldo de Campos called transcriação, transcreation, the product of a hybrid text that both valorizes and kills its predecessor. Few now read Latin and ancient Greek literature in the original. Fashionable transcreations have localized them in vernaculars. It's too late to turn the tide. And none have suffered more than the epic poets whose precise quantitative dactylic metrics have been stripped away. And of these, Ovid has lost most, ever since Ovid moralisé recreated him in French 14th century octosyllabic rhyming couplets and chastened his content long before Dr. Baudelaire gave sexual censorship his name. If you look on the number 1 on the screen, Sander Goldberg, a very good scholar, I'm not saying this necessarily in criticism of him, found that certain verbal effects, which even Virgil could seek, are tiresome to modern ears. I do not mean to slight the merits of Cicero's Aratea, merely to ignore them. And that is among some of the more charitable statements. As a Victorian scholar, almost a century and a half before Goldberg said of the famous pun on sosia and socius in Plautus, that in Plautus's Amphitrio, that this is a poor, purely sound-based pun, as if all puns weren't based on sound. I want to just remind us all that Roman children, number 2, rehearse letters and syllables by heart, backwards, forwards, and in random sequences. And Latin syllabic structures often escape notice by Anglophone scholars in particular, because our anagrams in English really aren't common in English literature. There's been no tradition of teaching them in England since the days of Aldhelm and Bede, and that was a very long time ago. Anagrams like thread and hatred can't be heard. Some which can, like unite and untie, produce exactly the sort of effect that Ovid loves, but they are horribly difficult, sometimes impossible to translate from one language to another. I'd have to become a Machado de Assis and translate the Metamorphoses posthumously to have time to do it. But I want to draw your attention immediately to something said by the scholar, the English scholar resident in America, Alan Cameron, in a piece called Ancient Anagrams, a most unfortunate piece. He cites, oops, what's happening to my screen here? He cites Aeneid 8, 322 to 33, capitalizing 6 syllables and declaring them scarcely an anagram as we understand the term. Latiumque vocari maluit, is quoniam latuisset in oris. But if you go to number 4, you'll see that Cameron has missed something and inadvertently refutes himself in his own quotation. So let's recapitalize it. Latiumque vocari maluit, is quoniam latuisset in oris. Latium and maluit are not only anagrams by anyone's standards, but also metrically mirroring anapestic and dactylic anagrams. Latium, where Saturn the seed god had lain latent, latuisset, is so named ultimately and aptly because the thought arose in his mind as his preference, maluit, its aptness reaffirmed by conventional anapestic etymologizing, is quoniam latuisset. That brings me to the point which I can't go into detail about here because this is a short paper. And once I get going on Plato's Cratylus, I'm unstoppable. So I will just restrict myself to one quotation. Language imitates nature in letters and syllables, says Socrates, not words. Virgil adds metrics. But it's really important to bear in mind that the musicality of dactylic verse in Latin and in Greek is based on syllables. Greek music did not score in its musical part any markers of duration. Those were supported entirely by the syllabic nature of the text. And let me give you an example now, so a fairly quick one here, from Horace in the Ars Poetica, who is making a comparison of pottery and other arts to the art of poetry. Amphora cepit institui, currente rota, cur urcius exit. Horace's potter starts a large Greek export container for wine or other product of, Michael Vickers notes, greater value than itself. This amphora, itself anagrammatizing Greek morphi and Latin forma, morphs into Latin urcius, an identically dactylic, smaller pitcher containing unchanged product, but for consumers, sharing no letters with its original. Yet cur incurrente, running, reiterated as cur y, delivers an anagrammatical urceus. Amphora cepit institui currente rota cur urcius exit. Can we go down the page, please? I need to go down the page. Yeah. An English approximation is difficult, metrically and linguistically. Urcius must be translated, but should amphora remain or give way to a foreign named but metrically identical, say, casserole, a pot, to convey the turning conversion? Urn, metrically shorter than urcius, works, but yields grimmer resonances. A casserole, an amphora started forming, but can you discern why it turns out an urn as the wheel runs? Now, I think Haroldo de Campos would, his ghost would agree with me on this, that dictionary translation isn't going to work because poetry and song resonate within a particular culture. And if we go now to number 9, we'll see how Ovid starts to use some of the anagrammatical, metrical propensities of words to aid with his description of metamorphoses. He lets constituent syllables and metrics metamorphose as do his subjects and environments. Narcissus in Metamorphoses 3, yearning to soften his thirst, is aroused by his mirror image in the water. Dumque sitim sedare cupit, sitis altera crevit. Sitim, thirst, shifts from other directed accusative to self-obsessed nominative, water-mirrored, metrically palindromic cities, itself a prelude to becoming soft meaties. Sedare, calm, quench, plays on se and dare, to give oneself to. And crevit is simultaneously from cresco, grow, and cerno, soar. He swells while watching his stiffness yielding a pair of Parian marbles. Number 10, though, Narcissus' reflected voice, echo, an alter ego, given Latin proximity of C and G, achieves unwanted separateness, denied to, but wanted by his reflected face. Come, let's get together, she cries, coeamus. Number 11, smilax, smilake, we find the form there, who is already bindweed by name, is rejected in favor of anagrammatical salmakis, smilake salmakis, suggesting and mirroring metrically unnamed lakeside reeds calamis, where she lurks before merging with Hermaphroditus in Ovid's only narrated nun-rape. Hermaphroditus departs his nurturing homeland in juxtaposed metrically mirroring anagrams, an antibacchius and a bacchius, altrice relicta. Now, how do you translate this? I've spent months, I suppose, over the years trying to translate it. The best I've yet been able to come up with is this in English, where suckled he skulked from, which captures only part of the syllabically anagrammatized metrics. And that, of course, is one of the big difficulties with Ovid, is that a great deal of him is not translatable unless you stray quite a bit from what people think of as the literal meaning of the text. And you see, that's why the Horace poem that I mentioned to you, the excerpt, is problematic, because when I first put that translation forward and used the word casserole to catch the sense of the turning in amphora, you know, a turned pot, everyone thought that I didn't know anything about ceramics, because everyone knows what an amphora is, you know, and you can't, you must not be disloyal to an archaeological object. Ours is still an object-centered discipline, and this makes it difficult to deal with poetry. The Metamorphosis begins with some very interesting language. Let me just read it out for a moment. There are all sorts of things there that I can't catch, but you can perhaps yourself catch some of them in the Latin. In nova fert animus mutatas dicere formas, corpora, di caeptis nam vos mutastis et illas adspirate meis, prima quab origine mundi ad mea perpetuum deducite tempora carmen. Now, I hope you can see what I'm trying to do with this, what I call approximation. These approximations I have done here throughout are metrically exactly the same as the Latin originals. In other words, I decided that in order to show what Ovid is doing, it was much more important that I was loyal to the metrics than to the exact dictionary meaning of words. Livening breath accords forms transmuted voice as they enter new bodies. God, since you mutated them, favor this labor now mine. Breathe it to life from primal cosmic beginnings down to my timings and times. Extend its continuous music. Between in nova and corpora, Ovid echoes his title, Metamorphoses, as mutatas formas, translated forms. And between mutatas and formas, he inserts dicere, speak. There's muteness in mutation. Gods become agents of form mutated and muted. Mutastis suggests mutas, none speaking. And Mirra, for example, will beg gods to deny life and death, but to grant her silenced metamorphosis. Mutate que mihi vitamque necemque negate. Forma, number 14, is physical shape and grammatical form, whose inflections Quintilian calls mutationes, mutations. Ovid gives voice to Orpheus's audience of creatures among people metamorphosed into voiceless trees. Can we go down now, please? Thank you. I want to draw your attention, in case you aren't a fan of Varro, as I am, Varro's declensions. Most translations convey dictionary meaning what a word verbum indicates significat, not the voice vocem its syllables produce. Varro, Lingua Latina 840. Good poets, Varro adds, have an obligation to accustom people's ears to well-calculated declensions that they've introduced and which the forum, i.e. official usage, will reject. Quas novas verbi declinationes, ratione introductas, respuet forum, is boni poete, consuetudine subigere aureis populi debens. Now, I want you just to take a look at a passage actually selected totally at random from one of 3 recent translations into English of the Metamorphoses. I say recent, 21st century, that'll do for recent. Charles Martin. You'll notice that it doesn't really have a clear metricity. And this is because, and if you haven't noticed, most modern English poetry is not written in meter, as anyone would understand it elsewhere. And not only that, but English dictionaries do not include meter as one of the defining factors of poetry. Nevertheless, all of them were saddened by the proposed destruction of the human race and wondered what the future form of Earth could possibly be like without men on it. Why, who would bring the incense at their altars? Was it his purpose to surrender Earth for wild beasts to plunder? And let's take a look at what Ovid actually wrote here. Est tamen humani generis iactura dolori omnibus, et quae sit terrae mortalibus urbe forma futura rogant, quis sit laturus in aras tura, ferisne paret populandas tradere terras. Let's look at it metrically just for a moment. 2 back-to-back Molossian perichiases, D measures, in 1-246, reinforced by a combination of Molossos spondeus, that is 5 longs, and a major ionic, dum-dum-diddy, and a sponde in 1-247, launch syllables indicating darkly humorous anxieties. Terre urbe, the orphaned earth, a Varronian declension of terrarum orbis, the orb of earth's lands, captured lands, terras, soon to be depeopled, populandas. Unstated concerns about Tura incense begin to creep in. Pain prompts questioning, introduced by quae sit, what might be, but sounding like quasit, it asks, even before they do ask, rogant, what form the incense-containing future, futura, may take. Quasit sharpens into quisit after rogant. Who'll be thurifer bringing la turus, needed and finally specified tura incense. So here's my approximation of 171, of number 17 rather. Thoughts of the human race linger as still painful sensations, questing inquire what form, what sense such wide dearth of mortals bodes. Their essential inquiries, who will bring us incense to altars if he raises the humans and leaves earth's raised land to raptors? And that's why I suppose the greatest metamorphosis in the whole of Ovid's Metamorphoses is the metamorphosis of Ovid himself. Number 19, and this is where I'll end. Iam corpus exegi quod nec Iovis ira nec ignis nec poterit ferum, nec edax abolere vetustas, cum valet, illa dies que nil, nisi corporis uius ius sabet, incertis spatium mi finiat evi. Parte tamen meliore mei super alta perennis astra ferar, nomen querit indelebile nostrum, quaque patet domitis Romana potentia terris, ora legar populi, verque omnia saecula fama, siquidabent verivatum praesagia vivam. A very strong ending for a work. Me, I'm going to live. And I'm going to be helped along my way by the fact that these dreadful Caesars have conquered the world and made everyone speak Latin. And so let's have a look now at what I tried to give as an approximation of the effect. And it's led me to some conclusions about how hexameters work in Latin. Well now, my work's complete. Not Jupiter's wrath, neither fire allied with sword, nor ravenous time will have power to destroy it. So the day death flies in bodes ill for no more than my body, ends just the unfixed phase of my being's continued existence. I, that is, my better part, shall remain. I'll be born over distant stars through eternal time. My name shall not be deleted in every conquered domain where Roman power opens access. I'll speak on everyone's lips, all centuries' favorite topic. If any truth finds home in bard soothsaying, I'll live on. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you a lot, Frederick.
Por nada.
Astonishing. But I would like now to begin the discussion. If anyone have some question, I don't know if there are questions in the chat. Ok.
Eu creio que não, Teodoro.
Não?
Se alguém quiser, pode fazer a questão também em português, ou fazer por voz, ou levantar a mão também. Levantar a mão ou por chat, perdão, né?
I could begin with
Paulo.
question.
Ok, bom dia a todos, good morning, bonjour. Bom, é um prazer, eu não pude ouvir na íntegra todas as apresentações, mas de qualquer forma foi uma magnífica, né, com 3 apresentações de alto nível. Eu gostaria só de né, parabenizar a organização, né, a professora Marcília e Teodoro, e cumprimentar os participantes, com um especial abraço ao professor Yiannis Petropoulos. Mas, de fato, eu não tenho comentários de conteúdo para fazer, eu só agradecer a palestra de vocês. É um prazer revê-los. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Luiz Paulo. May I ask a question to Jacqueline? Jacqueline? Yeah?
Yes.
Well, thank you all for your lectures, but Jacqueline, I would like just to ask you if you could explore a bit more the connection to Empédocles and the poem, if you... I know it's
it's little too complicated now, like that, without text. Huh?
But
because I am embarrassed about that because it's
Jacqueline, je crois que tu peux parler en français.
So I am not the text, so it's difficult to recall exactly. For example, seems to me I'm very embarrassed about to explain more precisely the relationship between Empédocles and Ovid. Damien Ellis, for example, wrote a paper on how the fight against Python is alluding to Empédocles, to the theory of Empédocles of the first human being, resulting from metamorphosis with hybrid forms, so like a monster. So they explain that very precisely by analyzing this episode of the end of the Gigantomachy, and in relation with Empédocles, for example. So, but it's little difficult to. We could analyze the speech of Empédocles in relation of Pythagoras in relation to Empédocles, to some fragment of Empédocles. For example, the praise of a man of Pythagoras is the same as the plane in Empédocles. So there exists precise relationship that has were analyzed by a number of researchers, but it's difficult to. We are the first book, and probably the 5th book, and the 15th book in relation to Empédocles, more or less precisely. But the speech of Pythagoras was analyzed by Philippe Hardy as Empédoclean, but in a very precise way. I could reproduce his explanation like that because I have a bad memory. I could explain that. So we have published. There exists some publication about Ovid, Virgile, and Empédocles. So.
Vous pouvez parler en français si vous voulez.
C'est la même chose, j'ai le même problème. Je ne saurais pas plus expliquer en français parce que il y a un certain nombre d'études, c'est ce que je disais en anglais, sur les relations entre Virgile et Empédocle, entre Ennius et Empédocle, entre Lucrèce et Empédocle. Hein, ce sont les études de Sedley, Furley. There is many studies about that, so the relationship between Lucretius, for example, Sedley has analyzed the beginning of the De Rerum Natura as a beginning, imitating the structure of the Periphyseos. There exist some studies about that, and he argues, and before him, Furley argues, and also other philosophers argue that there exist some references to Empédocles in the beginning of Lucretius. At the beginning, Sudley thought that it was only formal, but now he has changed his mind and considered that it is only about the philosophy of Empédocles. For some detailed elements of Empédocles are used by Lucretius and changed, modified by him in order to be compatible with Epicureanism. Okay, so there exist some studies about that written by Sedley and Furley, other specialists of philosophy, and some poeticians like Philippe Hardy, Damien Ellis, and I am quoted the name at the beginning, Don Rao Rourke, Alex Hardy, Philippe, and myself. So it's a part of the research on Ovid and Virgile. But the idea is there exists a tradition, epic tradition, impregnated by Empédocles from the beginning, from Ennius, and until Virgile and Ovid. So, but it is possible to see references to Empédocles in the Elegist also. Alex Hardy, for example, wrote a paper on Propertius 1:1 and Empédocles. Excuse me, but it is very. But the idea is more or less that the topic war and love could be put in relation to Nikos and Philia in Empédocles, and with the name, with the words discordia and concordia, that's as taken as marker of Empédocles, of references to Empédocles. I am.
That's okay. Thank you
I
very much.
apologize because I could send a biography, a bibliography about that, but it's difficult to enter into detail.
Okay, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Enfin, Jacqueline, moi aussi, j'avais pensé à une question là-dessus. Enfin.
Vas-y.
Ouais, non, mais enfin, je n'ai pas lu cet article de Philippe
Hardy.
Mais ce qui alors m'a étonné un peu, c'est le fait que, enfin, Ovide ne cite pas directement, il n'y a pas le nom d'Empédocle.
Oui, il n'y a pas le nom d'Empédocle, ouais. Mais la thèse de Hardy en 1995, c'est que, de toute façon, Virgile non plus ne cite pas Empédocle et Ennius non plus. Donc, et il n'y a que Lucrèce qui cite Empédocle, et sa théorie est que les métamorphoses sont un épos empédocléen dans la ligne d'Ennius, de Lucrèce et de Virgile, et c'est pour lui, Ovide s'établit comme un poète épique à l'intérieur de la tradition romaine qui, selon lui, est marquée sur le plan philosophique majeurement, de façon majeure par Empédocle, avec un relais très important qui est Lucrèce, qui lui, effectivement, loue Empédocle explicitement. Mais sinon, donc, et ce qui est utilisé beaucoup, c'est une lecture allégorique d'Homère, des amours de Mars et de Vénus, considérés par les anciens comme correspondant à l'opposition des forces empédocléennes, Nikos et Philia. Et donc, selon tous ces critiques, il y a une réception de la lecture d'Homère, de la lecture allégorique d'Homère, ce qui fait que pratiquement chaque fois que l'on trouve un récit sur Mars et Vénus, donc chez Lucrèce par exemple, mais ailleurs, chez les élégiaques, il y a une allusion, et ça renvoie à Empédocle. Dans Lucrèce, Mars est enserré par Vénus, qui lui demande la paix pour les Romains. Donc, on a le rapport guerre-paix et un positionnement politique déjà chez Lucrèce, cette demande de la paix pour les Romains par le biais de la victoire de la force d'union qui est Vénus sur Mars. Donc voilà, c'est... Le texte de Philippe Hardy, c'est un article de 1995, c'est assez ancien.
Ouais, non, pas tellement.
Non, mais il est un peu
là,
confidentiel. Il est confidentiel dans la mesure où seul un certain nombre de critiques travaillent dans cette perspective d'Empédocle.
Okay. Mais c'est alors excellent pour nous hein, de connaître hein, cette hypothèse, mais si elle est bien démontrée, c'est plus qu'une hypothèse.
Philippe Hardy, c'est un maître.
Ouais.
On peut faire confiance à Philippe Hardy. Hein,
mais de toute façon, ce qui m'a attiré l'attention là, c'est par exemple le fait que d'autres philosophes présocratiques travaillent aussi avec ces modèles d'opposer d'une possible à ce qu'on nomme la polarité.
Oui.
Et enfin, un philosophe comme Héraclite aussi,
oui.
Je crois qu'il pourrait éventuellement faire penser non seulement éventuellement même à une complémentarité entre opposés, mais à ces thèmes, ce sujet de la métamorphose. Je crois que c'était un thème très héraclitique.
Oui. Non. Le thème de la métamorphose, apparemment, c'est quand même semble-t-il, une particularité d'Ovide de mettre l'accent sur le changement des formes avec Empédocle, de mettre en relation avec Empédocle. Hein, c'est plutôt lui, puisque Virgile, disons, chez Empédocle, l'idée c'est qu'il y a c'est soit la force philiaque qui l'emporte, soit la force d'Aikos qui l'emporte. Donc il y a des mouvements, des changements sans arrêt alternatifs. Virgile a essayé de stabiliser avec l'idée de la Pax Romana et on stoppe. Et Ovide revient à ce mouvement d'Empédocle, du mouvement incessant. Et dans l'amour, c'est pareil, puisque dans l'amour, c'est victoire de l'amour, séparation, infidélité, et on recommence. Donc, la mutabilité qui est associée à la conception philosophique d'Empédocle a beaucoup intéressé les Romains, qu'ils s'intéressent donc à l'impérialisme, etc., ou qu'ils s'intéressent à des formes personnelles comme l'amour. Ça leur a semblé, apparemment, être une clé. A key reading about different experiences of life and of the history, individual and, on va dire, national life.
Ok, merci. Non, non, merci. Merci beaucoup. Alors, je crois que il
bon.
devient plus clair. Hein? Je crois que c'est bon de pouvoir parler un peu comme ça.
Oui, oui, bien sûr.
Ouais.
Parce que j'ai été allusive.
Non, non, pas exactement, mais enfin. Mais alors, je crois qu'on peut aussi poser des questions sur les autres exposés, les deux autres. Hein?
Theo, tem uma pergunta para o Fred no chat.
Eu vi. Na verdade, é um pedido, né? Podemos sim colocar esse pedido. Alors, questão para o professor Frederick. I would like to have an indication for the study of the metrical particularities of Ovid.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the question.
I'm working on one at the moment myself, which I'm hoping is going to appear in the Oxford Book of Greek and Latin Meter. Okay. But people really, because of the tradition in translation of translating into vernacular stress meters, I mean, apart, of course, you've got Nunes with the hexameter translations of Virgil and Homer, but he and Gniedich, the Russian translators, they're about the only people who routinely have established firmly in their countries metrical, musical translations. The moment you get rid in translation of the original metrics, you destroy the poetry. I mean, because you're turning it into something else. Just as if you were to turn a waltz into a march, it wouldn't be the same. And we totally forget how the ancient poets who wrote in dactylic meters thought of themselves as singers and talked of themselves as singers. And simply because we don't have the music doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't treat them as music. I mean, when people translate opera libretti, say the Italian translation of Tchaikovsky's Yevgeny Onegin observes completely the original metrics of Pushkin, which are kept despite the big controversy there was over Pushkin's lyrics in his novel Onegin, which no less a scholar than Nabokov got into a big fight about, because many people said you shouldn't keep Pushkin's original metrics in translation because they didn't work outside of Russian. But you had to keep them in opera, or you'd have to rewrite the musical score. But what we don't understand is that we're doing exactly what Haroldo de Campos said when we translate into other metrics. And so we are not going to be able to understand what Ovid and Virgil are really doing unless we pay attention to their metrics and find a way of conveying that in translation. That's my point, simply. Yeah. Rodrigo, tem questão?
Yes, thank you, Fred, for your wonderful presentation. Also, Jacqueline, merci beaucoup. Yiannis as well. It was a wonderful roundtable discussion. But I would like to ask Fred, will we ever see a complete translation of the Metamorphosis from your hexametrical or dactylic?
I won't live long enough to do it.
Really?
I mean, I'd need 30 years. I mean, one of the people who most infuriated me in the English-speaking world was Robert Graves, who in his preface to his translation of Lucan for Penguin said, "If I so dislike Lucan," he said, "why did I spend 6 months translating him?" He said, 6 months? I spent 13 years translating Virgil, and I still was unsatisfied with the result. We totally underestimate the complexity of these writers, just totally. And what we're doing is churning out translations for people who don't know Latin or Greek so that they can read them in translation courses where the Metamorphoses gets a week and a half in an epic course, and the kids have to get something out of it in a week and a half. So you have to have them give them a translation that is so dumbed down that there's no poetry left in it.
Yeah, well, I've translated the full Lucretius in hexameters in Portuguese. It came out last year, and I'm working now on Metamorphosis.
Well, you must do this
in hexameters as well, and it's coming out next year. And the next one will be the Aeneid. So
good for you.
Let's try to keep it up.
Bravo,
but
bravo.
What I would like to ask from you is, wouldn't you even try to translate 1 or 2 books with because your approach to meter and metric translation is not only what we do here, like me and Nunes and Guilherme. We keep the rhythm, but we don't try to reproduce, for example, the anagrams and the most of the puns.
Yeah, well, you see, but that is something you really have to do.
Yes,
because
I can't. It's too difficult. But anyway.
Well, I know it's difficult, but you just have to do it. I mean, the problem with translators is that so many of them, and I know it's not true of you, anyone who makes as good a beer as you do can't possibly be a dishonest translator. But the problem is that people want to do this quickly. The publishers want translations that they can use for 2-week immersion.
Yeah.
And not only that, but as people like Alan Cameron and others just don't want to hear about wordplay. They hate it. I mean, look at what happened to Chaucer when he was translated into modern English. Calchas, who knew by calculinga that Troia shoulder destroyed be, becomes Calchas, knew by computation that Troy was doomed. You know, and this is when you have an original that's still intelligible to an English speaker. They want this stuff out. They hate it, and you see that in the Cambridge history of classical literature. Look at the pieces on the Silver Age poets. These guys just despise them, and you're not going to get good translations when you've got people who think that they are smarter than the people they're translating. I mean, you know, and I know, and Yiannis knows, and others in this group know that we aren't in the same league as these people. Yeah, that we are scholars.
Thank you, Fred.
But Jacqueline,
Jacqueline.
I have a question for
votre présentation. Merci beaucoup.
I have a question for you. I'm very interested in translating, and it seems to me that translating is a more or less impossible process. It's very difficult, and if we take the poetry, is more difficult. And if we take, like you have shown, the fact that there exists play on metrics words, it would be more impossible, because this engage the interpretation also. Probably when the poet, you add complexity by playing on sounds, words, and playing on the word, it's become more difficult to translate. You could add an explanation, an interpretation.
Yeah, but that's not, that doesn't translate. An explanation is a comment. And if you're going to, if I'm trying to tell students what makes Virgil or Homer a genius, I've got to be able to show them in the work, not just in a comment on the side. You have to believe this guy is a genius, even though I can't translate his puns. But you see, what we've done is locked ourselves into a way of using language. And you can see it even more clearly in Greek than in Latin. That because people insist on translating the word aletheia into English as truth, they totally destroy everything that Parmenides and Socrates and Plato say about aletheia. And we've got to find another way to do it.
Yes, I know, I understand, but it's very interesting. Your analysis is very interesting because you add complexity to the combination of words. If you add also the fact there exist anagrams and combination of sounds, so it's become more difficult.
I'm not putting these in Ovid. They're already there.
No, absolutely. It's mine.
And you see, if we don't find a way of teasing them out, we're missing what the poet is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. It seems I say only it is more difficult. It is very, very interesting and more difficult to translate. If we think about the mythological, for example, games included in the verses.
Yeah, but let me just give you one example. You were talking about Empédocle and the fact that there's no mention, and someone else brought this up. I can't remember who it was now. Was it Rod? Yeah, it was you, Teodoro. You said that Empédocle is never named. But you see, is Lucretius named? Is Lucretius named in the Metamorphoses?
Why?
Is he?
I don't know.
Well, he's not. And it's interesting, but you've got several passages where you can show by wordplay that Lucretius is definitely being targeted.
Yes.
For example, Omnia de Nihilo, which is Ovid's making fun of Lucretius's argument that you can't get nothing from nothing. You can't. And this, but he of course is using Nilo not as from nothing, but from the Nile. And so if you don't get that, you're missing the joke. And what people do all the way through, just as they miss the jokes in the Aeneid. The Aeneid is such a funny poem in so many ways. And you see the way that Ovid uses the Aeneid to really give a scandalous portrait of Augustus, because in, say, Book 1 of the Aeneid, you have Aeneas being threatened by a storm, and he's saved by, of all people, Neptune, who was Octavian's least favorite god, the sponsor of his arch enemy, Sextus Pompey, and who isn't even trying to save Aeneas. He's just annoyed because his realm is being disturbed. And because there's been a breakdown in the system that Jupiter has a fede certo, which no one's observing. So it's a breakdown of the Republic. Then he goes on to compare Neptune to Octavian, right? Now, Ovid uses exactly the same sets of word plays and anagrams to show what's going on in book 1 of the Metamorphoses, where Jupiter is compared, as where the gods rather, approving Jupiter without knowing what he's going to do or why he's doing it, is going to have the world destroyed.
Yes, absolutely.
and so that Virgil's broken down world is this active Putin-like tyranny of Jupiter in Ovid. And then people say, well, did Ovid get exiled because he had an affair with Julia? Sorry, no Julia's locally mentioned here, right? But I mean, everyone had an affair with Julia. You couldn't even make the social scene if you hadn't bedded Julia, you know. That's not why he was sent to Tomi. He's sent to Tomi because of what he wrote in book 1 of the Metamorphoses, if not what
absolutely
he
no.
before.
It's for his poetry. He was was punished. I agree with you. It's the first and major reason. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed. If I'd been Augustus, I'd have had him killed, actually.
Thank you very much.
There we are. But you see, this is the beauty. This poet is so wonderful. And I feel the same way about all these, the major Roman epic poets.
And Cecilia also.
Well,
we haven't done them credit. You haven't done. Oh, and I did have a question though to ask Yiannis.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I love that episode that you talk about, and it always has struck me that Arachne is sort of Ovid, female Ovid. But if you after all, she is weaving like Penelope, working the loom of Penelope, in much the same way. She is the counterpoise to him, just as in the Odyssey, right? Penelope saves herself by using the histon, the loom, but just as Odysseus saves his life in book 5 by clinging onto the histos in the other sense of the mast of a ship. I mean, they're both the same word. And if a translator doesn't give you the same word for both, then the translator's cheating you. Right?
Yeah, I like that. Yes, yes.
And that's why at the end of the Odyssey, when Penelope embraces him, she is like a sailor. I mean, but it's made that way because she, in her way, has done what Odysseus does in his way. And so it's these tiny details that make things work. Now, the interesting thing is, how many successful rapes does Apollo conduct in the Metamorphoses? 0. Right? I mean, and that are actually narrated, or, you know, I mean, there are references, Coronis and so on, but actually, he's given more credit by Arachne than he is by Ovid, qua narrator.
Right.
And it's a very, very interesting procedure, the way Ovid will use these internal artistic scenes to reflect his own artistic dilemma. And it's interesting how differently he phrases those in the elegiac poetry to the Metamorphoses, but that's another story. But the Arachne is just a simply wonderful passage, and I really enjoyed that, your exposition of it. Just want to say that, just as
thank you.
I'll have to go and think now about it in Empédocle too. Enough, I've said enough, I'll shut up.
Frederick, a little bit louder. We were losing your voice.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, but
Desculpe-me.
Cecilia also has a question.
Yeah.
Cecilia.
Yes. Well, thank you all. And it was so nice to listen you and Jacqueline about translation. And just before a question to Petropoulos, more a comment Fred, there is a comment by Raul Costa for you.
I didn't see it.
Dear Professor Fred, I really appreciate such a lecture and recitation. I don't have a question, but a request. Please record some audiobooks reciting or teaching how to recite properly and vividly a poem, etc. I will send you the whole. But just a question, Yiannis, thank you very much. And it's not a question, it's a comment, if you could say something about, because when you say that Metamorphosis was presented translators as a sort of disguise in your text, this reminds me very much the end of Plato Republic, the book 2, when Plato used, and in general in Portuguese, the translators, they use metamorphoses to translate metabalin. When the gods, they transform to deceive people, and the word in Greek is apathe. And so this connection between apathe and metabalin, when it came to Portuguese, it came as metamorphoses, and a sort of disguise to deceive. And in this moment, Plato is criticizing all the poets, Aeschylus, Homer, and also the Goethe, the Mageia, and all this sort of, it's a group of words connect to the same process, it seems. It's just a comment.
Yes. Metabalin can be the synonym of metamorpho, although the Greeks rather preferred the passive form, metamorphosai, in Greek. Do you see what I mean? That yeah.
Could I put in something there?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, because I assume that you're thinking about Republic 565 and 566. That is the Socrates talking about the tyrannic soul, and he does exactly what you talk about there. He uses a whole series of words compounded from balo. You know, how does this turnaround, metavoli, from being a prostatis to a tyrant? Well, he's when he's turned out to ekbalete, and he returns, right? And all of these are compounds from balo. They turn on him ekbalin, and then they abuse him verbally, diavalin, and finally he metavalete is likon. He turns into a wolf. So you that entire and
well, actually, I was thinking in book 2, in the end of book 2, when he's criticizing the gods as a foreigner, and he connects the foreigner with a sophist and with apathe, with mageia, goetheia, all this group of words. But it was very nice that you connect to the tyrant and the soul of the tyrant, because there is also this connection. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, if I may add, in metabalo, I don't know, does it mean simply disguise, or can it mean change permanently into something different?
It does in the Plato passage that I quoted. Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely, it means it's definitely used. Well, the metavoli ek prostatu is tyrannon. I think I'm getting that right.
Is tyrannon. Yes.
Yeah.
So it's an ace. It's a direction into something.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So in theology, metabole is a change. I don't want to say transubstantiation, that's the Roman or the Catholic term, but it's used also in Orthodox theology. It's something that changes in whatever, I don't know, in essence, metabole. But you know, coming back to Arachne, she weaves illusionistically, right? So she's deceiving through her art in portraying deception. So it's a sort of illusion within an illusion. Perhaps Ovid is saying something about art also. I don't know.
Yeah, well, of course, you think that one of the things that Virgil does in Aeneid 1 and again in 4 is he talks about all the deception involved with Dido and her brother Pygmalion. And it's interesting that of course that Pygmalion is picked up in a different way. It's not the same Pygmalion allegedly, but that's brought up by Ovid too. But the idea that Dido is convinced for a long time that her husband Sychaeus is still alive, and how do you do this? I mean, you do have a sort of doll like Admetus has in Euripides' Alcestis. And that whole business of the imago and what an imago is, and what an eidolon is. And this is where all these planes of poetry and philosophy keep intersecting. And that's it's what makes Latin epic so different from Greek, because when Virgil says, after talking about at the opening of the Aeneid, when he says, this man, Italiam fato profugus, that's for the Stoics, and tot volvere casus, that's for the Epicureans. And then he's driven by the saeve memorem eunonis obiram, and that's for the Homerists. And then he turns and says, tante nenimis celestibus ire, and every Epicurean in the audience would say no. Every Stoic would say no. Every Platonist would say no. And yet all the modern commentators want to say yes, because it's a rhetorical question. It expects the answer yes. No, it's not. That's what we take, this inert approach to what these guys are doing. And just as we forget, for example, that in Book 2 of the Aeneid, that most other writers record that Aeneas's wife is named Eurydice, not Creusa. So that when Aeneas loses his wife by failing to look back, it becomes this inversion of the whole Orpheus myth. Because Orpheus loses his wife by looking back, and Aeneas says he loses his by failing to look back. And if you bear in mind that her name is Eurydice in most other traditions, then it makes sense. But we don't put these things together. And that's what I'm saying is and what you're doing, what you've done with this Metamorphosis is a really important addition, because showing, in a sense, that Metamorphosis has this much more complicated side, that is the disguise. It takes me back to the beginning, if you will, of Euripides' Helen. You remember Helen says at the beginning, after correctly describing the sources of the Nile, the first person to do that until Speke did it in the 19th century, she then says that Leda was, according to a story, a logos, and it's interesting that it's a logos, not a mythos, was attacked by Zeus, who was disguised as a swan being pursued by an eagle. Now, you can say, all right, I can get the Metamorphosis, but how do you disguise yourself as a swan being pursued by an eagle? Do you get a coat hanger and sort of you put on your swan suit and then you hang. Or do you say, well, of course, that's just astral because the swan constellation is a northern constellation that's pursued across the sky by the eagle constellation, and the eagle is always going to set before the swan does, so the swan will always triumph, which the swan does everywhere except the Aeneid, in battles with an eagle, which can occur only in myths since they don't happen in real life. And so you're in these worlds of complex illusions, and that question is, who is it? Where is it? Is it Plautus's Amphitryo, where someone says that Jupiter becomes versipellis.
Yes.
He becomes a versipellis whenever he's turned on. Yeah. Is that am I right? Is that Amphitryo?
Yes.
I don't think it is. But the idea then of the versipellis is important, because that takes you into the sort of werewolfy area. And that, I think, becomes important when you're dealing with Zeus, because the main Jupiter figure that you have is the one associated with the Lycian Jupiter in Arcadia. I mean, that's the whole business of the Molossian hostage. Now, it's interesting that Ovid modulates his dactyls with Molossian metrics, except a Molossian metric is 3 long syllables, whereas a Molossian as a person is a Bacchius.
Yes.
And all the way through, there's this sort of tension and the wolf nature, and how you can change into something without actually changing. That you put nat lupus inter oves. When you drop a lupus into water, he becomes a ludamer, lupo di mare, and he doesn't have to change, but he's suddenly a food fish, and an ovis is a provaton, is a killer whale, an orca. So suddenly the relationship in the food chain is changed by an alteration of situation. So all of these things are being factored in. And there's a lot going on that I don't understand in that. In that Arachne.
Cecilia, I'm afraid of our lateness, the time, because we have also some talks this afternoon. That's the problem.
Yes. Well, let's invite you to come to Brazil in person and to discuss about this, Fred, Jacqueline, and Petropoulos. Then we have to finish, and now because we have the next session, the second, at 2 p.m. And I invite all of you to listen to the Latinist Amarante, the translator of Fulgêncio, and also Connie Bloomfield, who is working on Cornell and Homer in the northeast of Brazil, and Lorena, who is, we'll talk about Homer in 19th century in France. Then at 2, às 2 da tarde, nós teremos a segunda mesa. Thank you all.
Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Merci.
Muito obrigado a todos.
Merci, Jacqueline.
Obrigada a todos também.
Obrigada a todos.
Felicitações a todos. Muito obrigado.
Você também,
and Frederick, I'll send you a query. I have a query about Latin. I'll send it to you by email.
Okay, thanks.
Right. Thank you. Muito obrigado. Boa continuação. Boa continuação.
Sim, obrigado, Yiannis.
Muito obrigado, Teodoro.
Frederick, Jacqueline. Thank you all.
Merci.
Obrigado.
Obrigada, boa tarde.
Au revoir, Jacqueline.
Au revoir à tout le monde. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité. C'est très, très
Merci beaucoup à toi.
Bon plaisir.
C'était un plaisir de te revoir.
Obrigada, boa tarde, então.
Ok.